My name is Sandra, and I am the mother of Michael, a college student who is 18 years old. In order to provide him with a better future, my husband, Brian, and I have been making many sacrifices for years to fund his schooling. These sacrifices have included foregoing holidays and making every effort to restrict our budget. We live in a small but comfortable house that was my grandmother's before she went into a nursing facility. I oversee the front desk at a doctor's office, while Brian works at a nearby hardware shop. We lead a straightforward, uncomplicated lifestyle that works perfectly for us. It was a typical Thursday afternoon, the sun positioned perfectly in the sky, hinting at the weekend ahead, when Brian's phone interrupted the peace. I was preparing dinner, my thoughts split between the meal and our budget, when I heard him answer the call with a concern, "Hello." "Mom, slow down. What's wrong?" As I watched him pace back and forth, his face drained of color. The call ended, and he collapsed onto the sofa, looking utterly deflated. "It's my parents," he said. "Their business has gone under. They're bankrupt, and they've lost everything, including their house." My heart sank at the news. "Oh, Brian, that's awful. What are they planning to do?" "They want to stay with us for a while," he replied, clearly worried about our reaction. "Just until they sort things out." I paused, considering our already tight finances and the structured piece of our life that was now at risk of being disrupted. "And what did you tell them?" I asked. Brian massaged his neck, a sign of his stress. "I said I'd talk to you first. It's your house too, Sandra. I wouldn't decide this without consulting you." Brian's parents, Terry and Catherine, were far from easygoing, accustomed to a luxurious lifestyle. Our simple home was a stark contrast to what they were used to. You know how they are. This house, it's not really their style, I reminded him. "I know," he replied, his expression troubled. "But they're my parents, Sandra. They're in a tough spot." Recalling the numerous times they had visited, barely concealing their disdain for our humble living arrangements, I knew they would be uncomfortable here. Yet seeing them desperate enough to ask for help softened my stance. "All right, they can stay, but it's temporary, right? Just until they get back on their feet." Brian immediately picked up his phone, and after a brief conversation, he reassured his mother. "Mom, Sandra and I talked it over. You can stay for a bit, but you need to find your place soon. We're not running a hotel." I couldn't hear the response, but Brian's firm, "Yes, Mom, we're clear," told me enough. He hung up, visibly relieved. "They're thankful, Sandra. They'll be here next week." Last week, we told Brian's parents they could stay with us temporarily, and today they were moving in. I stood on the porch, my heart sinking slightly as two large moving trucks rolled up the driveway. Brian, managing a forced smile, directed the unloading process like a parking lot attendant. Terry was the first to emerge, slapping Brian on the back with a grin as if he'd just won the lottery. Catherine approached me next, her perfume overwhelming, as she planted a kiss on my cheek that felt scalding. "You're an angel for letting us invade like this," she said. I managed to smile, my eyes shifting nervously to the mountain of belongings being unloaded, a tangible sign of the upheaval to come. As Catherine and the movers unloaded what she referred to as just the essentials from their moving trucks, I couldn't help but gape at the array of furniture and boxes that seemed to flood our modest front yard. "Is this all just essentials?" I mumbled under my breath, trying hard to keep my tone light. "Oh yes, just the basics for now," Catherine responded nonchalantly, waving her hand as if the mountain of belongings wasn't overtaking every inch of space. I bit my tongue, wondering what they had left in storage and if these were the items deemed necessary for their temporary stay. Brian caught my gaze, and I could tell he shared my concern. Let's just try to get all this inside, he murmured partly to himself, his tone a mix of resignation and disbelief, as Terry and Catherine directed the movers with a precision that seemed better suited for a luxurious estate than our simple home. The movers struggled past with armchairs, an endless number of boxes, and even a grandfather clock. Right there, that's perfect. Terry directed them to place the clock as though it was the most natural addition to our living room, which was quickly disappearing under the influx of their possessions. I pulled Brian aside as the movers took a moment to catch their breath. Brian, this is madness. They've brought enough stuff to furnish an entire house. Where are we supposed to put all of this? Brian rubbed his temples, a sign of his growing frustration. I know, Sandra. I'll talk to them, I promise. Let's just get through today. As the movers resumed, our ground floor transformed into a cluttered showcase of Terry and Catherine's old lifestyle. Every corner was filled, every space overtaken. By the time the movers left, our once cozy living room resembled more of a storage unit than a family space. Dinner that night felt like navigating a labyrinth. We barely managed to uncover the dining table beneath all the clutter. Terry and Catherine seemed completely oblivious to the chaos, blissfully chatting about their journey as Terry opened a bottle of pricey French wine. Sandra, you really should try this, he insisted, pouring a glass with a flourish. Thank you both so much for having us, Catherine added sweetly, her voice almost too sugary as she continued. It's just until we find our feet. Brian, clearing his throat nervously, attempted to set some boundaries. Yeah, about that. We need to talk about some ground rules. Spaces tightened. Oh, don't worry about it, son, Terry interrupted with a dismissive wave. We'll manage just fine, won't we, dear? He smiled at Catherine, who nodded enthusiastically, looking around at the invaded space, the piles of boxes, the ostentatious ornaments displacing our simpler decor. I wasn't so sure about that. Adjusting to life with Terry and Catherine was proving to be more challenging than I'd anticipated. A few days later, as we settled into a new sort of routine, another challenge emerged. It was Tuesday evening, and I was preparing a simple dinner, spaghetti, when Catherine walked into the kitchen, her nose wrinkling in disdain. What's that smell? She asked, her tone dripping with disapproval. It's dinner, I replied, striving to keep my voice calm. Spaghetti. Where's the meat? The fresh herbs? She scoffed, peering over my shoulder with a critical eye. Brian, hearing the commotion, came in, drying his hands on a dish towel. What's the problem? The problem, Brian, is that we're expected to eat this. Catherine gestured dramatically towards the pot of simmering sauce as though it were unsavory. Taking a deep breath to maintain my composure, I explained, it's what we usually eat. We can't afford steaks and fancy meals every night. As tensions flared in the kitchen, Brian intervened, his expression stern. Mom, this is Sandra's home too, and this meal is what we normally eat. If you prefer something else, feel free to cook it yourself, he said firmly. Catherine's eyes narrowed as she retorted. The stark difference was not just in our meals, but was etching a deeper divide between us. Each day, unable to contain my frustration any longer, I spoke up. This has to stop. We can't keep living like this, eating different meals. It's ridiculous. From now on, everyone in this house will eat the same food, and we will stick to what we can afford. Terry left dismissively, a grating sound that tested my last nerve. You expect us to eat that slop? It's not slop, it's dinner. It's what we eat. I retorted, my patience wearing thin. Terry's laughter stopped abruptly, his face turning into a scowl. Catherine's tone was sharp and accusing. How can you be so greedy and lazy? Cooking decent food isn't that hard. They both turned to Brian, their expressions full of expectation, as if prompting him to side with them. That was the final straw for Brian. He slammed his hand down on the table, causing the plates to clatter. "First off, this is Sandra's house as much as mine, and you will treat her with respect," he declared, his voice resonant with authority. Catherine's eyes welled with tears, her voice quivering as the impact of Brian's words sank in. "I never thought I'd see the day when you, my son, would shout at me like that." Terry's frustration had reached a boiling point as he stood there, pointing his finger accusingly at Brian. "Look at you, completely whipped and following her every command. Is this really who you've become?" I maintained my composure, though my heart raced. "Enough. This conversation is finished. From now on, no more lavish spending on steaks or seafood. We all eat the same simple meals." Their stares could have frozen the room in that moment of stillness. Then silently, Terry and Catherine pushed their chairs back and left the table. Brian and I sat back down, enveloped in the heavy silence. He reached out and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said. I nodded, feeling the burden of the evening's events. "I am too, but it's the right choice. We can't go on like this." After the dinner blow-up, the atmosphere at home cooled, but only superficially. Terry and Catherine were noticeably quieter, but their silence had an underlying tension that kept me on edge. I sensed they weren't ready to accept the new household rules without a fight. A few days later, as I was cleaning up from a simple lunch of sandwiches, the doorbell rang. I dried my hands on a towel and walked to the front door, expecting a delivery or a neighbor. Instead, I found a delivery man with a large fragrant bag from a fancy local restaurant. "Delivery for Sandra," he announced, checking his clipboard. Confused, I said, "There must be some mistake." "I didn't order this." Just then, Catherine appeared with an overly bright smile. "Oh, I decided to treat us to a nice meal." "We deserved a little comfort after all the tension," she explained. I took the bag with hesitation. "Catherine, we discussed this. We're cutting back on expenses." She avoided my gaze, shrugging. "I thought it was on your tab, dear. My mistake." Brian entered from the kitchen, catching the tail end of our conversation. "What's going on?" he asked. "Your mother thinks we deserved an expensive lunch," I replied, the weight of the bag suddenly feeling even heavier. Brian's expression darkened. "Mom, we agreed no more of this." Terry's voice boomed from the hallway. "What harm is a little lunch going to do? You can't expect us to live like hermits forever." I placed the bag down, feeling my frustration rise. It's not just the lunch, it's every unnecessary expense. We've already told you we're sticking to a budget. Catherine's demeanor turned icy. "If you're going to fuss over a simple meal, perhaps we won't bother next time." Brian pinched the bridge of his nose, exasperated. "It's not just about the meal. It's about respecting the household rules. You can't keep undermining us." The argument circled for a few more minutes until Terry and Catherine withdrew to their room, leaving the untouched, costly lunch on the table. Brian and I exchanged glances, a silent agreement between us that this couldn't continue. "I'll call the restaurant, explain the situation, and cancel any future orders made without our approval," I declared, picking up the phone. Brian nodded, his resolve firm. "I'll have another talk with them. This sneaky behavior has to stop." The peace was fleeting. After the incident with the unauthorized lunch, Catherine and Terry simmered with barely concealed resentment. The tension was palpable, and it felt as though you could slice through it with a knife. One evening, while I was washing dishes, the calm shattered once more. Brian had just come in from the yard, looking tired. I was about to ask him about his day when a sudden crash from the living room had us both sprinting to investigate. We discovered Terry looming over a shattered vase, one of the few household treasures I deeply valued. "What just happened?" Brian asked, his voice measured despite the chaos. "It just slipped out of my hand," Terry responded, his eyes barely reflecting any remorse. His tone wasn't one of apology. Rather, it carried a defiant edge. Brian crouched to collect the broken pieces, and I couldn't keep quiet any longer. This vase was an heirloom from my grandmother. It has more history with this house than all of us. Catherine, leaning against the doorway dismissively, said, "It's just a vase. You can always find another." "That's not the point, Catherine." I shot back, irritation rising in me. This is about respect, something that's evidently lacking around here. "You want to talk respect?" Terry retorted, raising his voice. "How about the way you treat us like we're second-rate residents in our own home?" Brian rose to his feet and faced his father directly. "You're here because we allow it, Dad. Don't forget that." "It doesn't feel like we're allowed anything." Catherine interjected sharply. "It feels like we're merely tolerated." Living with Terry and Catherine felt like navigating a field of landmines, but one particular evening drove me to my limit. We were sitting at the dinner table, the epicenter of many past disputes, when Catherine dropped her astonishing new request. "Brian, I saw a lovely coat today, and I think we should use Michael's college fund to buy it," she said as nonchalantly as if she were talking about changing coffee brands. I choked on my drink, coughing as I set my glass down forcefully. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" My voice was a mixture of disbelief and escalating fury. With a sweet smile, Catherine mistook my astonishment for acquiescence. "It's only money, dear. Michael can take out loans for college. I do need a new coat." Brian, who had been silently fuming, slammed his fork down. "Mom, that's not happening. That fund is for our son's future, not for your shopping spree." Catherine's expression turned sour. "How can you deny your mother such a simple thing?" "It's not simple, and we're not discussing this further," I declared, my last shred of patience dissolving. Terry raised his voice, now echoing off the walls. "You're being unreasonable and cruel. We are your family." He then threatened coldly, "Perhaps the local news would be interested in how you treat your parents. What would your employers think?" The mix of anger and apprehension roiled within me, but my resolve hardened enough. I stood up, my voice firm. "This is not how a family behaves. You two need to look for another place to stay. This arrangement isn't working." Catherine started crying, assuming the role of the aggrieved, while Terry continued his barrage of accusations and threats. The dinner ended with them leaving the room in a huff, and Brian and I were left in a deafening silence. Once the house quieted, I retreated to our bedroom and called my grandmother. She answered after a few rings, her voice a soothing balm. "Grandma, it's Sandra," I began, my voice choked with emotion. "What's troubling you, my dear?" she inquired, instantly concerned. I spilled everything. The incessant demands, the threats, the untenable situation with Catherine and Terry. She listened quietly, her occasional murmur a comforting presence. When I finished, she spoke decisively. "I'll come and stay with you for a few months." "Are you sure, Grandma? What about the nursing home?" "I'm certain. It sounds like you need me right now." When Grandma declared she wouldn't stand by while our family was in turmoil, her voice was resolute and full of determination. Her arrival felt like a refreshing breeze had blown through our tense home. Although age had slowed her physically, her spirit remained as vibrant as ever. Terry and Catherine were noticeably discomforted by her sudden presence. Their unease was palpable. "I'll be staying on the ground floor. Grandma announced authoritatively as she entered, her suitcase trailing behind her like a faithful pet. I expect we might need to rearrange some things. Terry's irritation was thinly veiled behind a forced smile. Of course, we'll make sure you're comfortable, right? He looked towards Catherine, who nodded rigidly, her eyes darting about, likely calculating the inconvenience this rearrangement would pose. Feeling a surge of relief, I was grateful that someone was finally setting things straight. Once the movers had adjusted our living space to accommodate Grandma, she wasted no time in calling a family meeting. Now, I've heard a lot from Sandra about the ongoing issues, and I'm far from pleased, she began sternly, cutting through any semblance of pleasantries. Terry started to object, but Grandma raised her hand, silencing him. I'm not finished. Technically, this house is still under my name, and while I've allowed Sandra and Brian to stay here rent-free, that privilege doesn't extend to you too. Catherine's face paled. You want us to pay rent, she blurted out. Yes, I do. $5,500 a month, Grandma stated flatly. That's outrageous. Terry protested, standing up abruptly. Considering the expenses you've incurred, it seems you could manage by reducing some of your luxuries. Grandma retorted sharply. But we're family. Catherine interjected, her voice shaky. Family doesn't take advantage of each other, Grandma countered firmly. Since you've been living beyond your means at my granddaughter's expense, I find it only fair. Terry and Catherine were speechless, exchanging glances as if searching for an escape but finding none. And one more thing, Grandma continued. If you find the rent too steep, you're welcome to look for another place to live. Alternatively, if you choose to stay, you'll assist me daily. I need help moving around, meals prepared, and someone to ensure I take my medications. Catherine's earlier bravado had completely vanished. She looked like a fish out of water. Terry, who had always valued his independence, seemed as if he'd been struck. Think it over, Grandma concluded, her voice softening slightly. I need your decision by tomorrow morning. As they retreated to their room, presumably to discuss their limited options, Grandma turned to us, her expression gentler. Don't worry, kids. We'll sort this mess out. The morning after, Grandma laid out her new house rules. It was as if a switch had been flipped in Terry and Catherine. I entered the kitchen to find them packing their belongings, a growing pile of boxes near the door. We've decided to move out, Terry declared, not looking up from the box he was sealing. We found a small apartment. We'll take our things and go. Catherine was busier stuffing items into bags with swift, sharp movements. It's for the best, she muttered, almost to herself, but loud enough for me to hear. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity as boxes and furniture moved out the door. Brian helped more out of a sense of duty than desire, as our home finally began to feel like a sanctuary again. By mid-afternoon, the section of the house that Terry and Catherine had occupied was eerily silent, a testament to their swift exit. The echo of their departure lingered long after they had driven away. Grandma, who had been observing quietly from her chair, gave me a knowing look. Well, that's that then. They'll be all right, you know. Sometimes a bit of hardship is necessary to bring people back down to earth. We later learned that they had sold most of their possessions to cover the rent and their other debts. The luxurious lifestyle they were accustomed to had been pared down to the essentials, much like their new modest apartment. Grandma stayed with us for another 3 weeks, her presence a comforting constant in our home. But eventually, she decided it was time to return to her nursing home. Driving her back, I felt a blend of sadness and relief wash over me. Thanks for everything, Grandma. We couldn't have managed without you, I told her. She waved off my thanks with a chuckle. Oh, nonsense. You're stronger than you think. Just remember to stand up for yourselves. No one else will do it for you." Her words bolstered my confidence. I said farewell to her, assuring her that I would come back to visit soon. As I made my way back home, the space seemed more expansive and the silence deeper than before. That evening, Brian and I settled into our porch chairs, the gentle evening breeze comforting us. Life had certainly presented its challenges, but we had managed to navigate them successfully and were prepared for what lay ahead. We were confident in our ability to face the future as a team, regardless of what anyone else thought.